She was sitting on the kitchen counter when I walked through the door, which was already unusual. Mara preferred sofas and floor cushions, and that one specific chair by the window she had unofficially claimed the morning she moved in and never once relinquished. Counters were for coffee mugs and unopened mail, and the occasional grocery bag she didn't have the energy to deal with. Not for Mara Chen, sitting cross-legged in her socks, hands folded in her lap, wearing the expression of someone who had already composed herself to receive whatever came next. On the counter in front of her was my journal. She didn't say anything. She let me notice it. Watched me understand what it meant, that it was there. That she was sitting 3 feet from it, with her hands that still, and her face doing something I couldn't immediately name. Then, she set a second journal down beside mine. Hers, navy blue, spine soft and cracked from years of heavy use. A small ink stain on the lower right corner she'd acquired during a failed attempt at calligraphy and never explained. She slid my journal toward me across the counter, without speaking. "Read page 47, she said. She meant hers. I opened it. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I write product copy for companies that sell ergonomic desk chairs, vitamin subscriptions, and small batch hot sauces that describe themselves as artisanal. This means my professional life is the project of finding compelling things to say about products that don't strictly require compelling things said about them. I am reasonably good at this. I am considerably less capable of saying the true thing about myself, out loud, to a real person standing in front of me, without 4 to 6 working drafts and a reasonable grace period." Mara Chen moved in across the hall 4 years ago, the day after I'd had the kind of moving experience that makes a person unfriendly for the better part of a week. I was standing in the hallway with a box of kitchen equipment and the expression of a man who has just discovered that the previous tenant's cabinet mounts a line with no version of reality he can verify. She looked at the box, looked at me, and said, "Is that a wok?" "I have been trying to borrow a wok from someone in this building for 3 months. I confirmed it was. She said, "Excellent. You're useful. We should be friends." That was her formal introduction. I've since been told this is entirely characteristic. We became friends the way you do when you live 20 feet apart and your walls are thin enough to learn each other's alarm tones. She knew I kept the apartment 3 degrees colder than was reasonable. I knew she alphabetized her bookshelves when anxious about things entirely unrelated to books, that she couldn't eat lunch without a podcast running, and that she had 3 distinct laughs. One for when something was mildly amusing, one for when something was genuinely funny, and a third rarer one I'd heard only a handful of times, when something caught her completely off guard. 2 years ago, when my lease ended and her previous roommate moved to Edinburgh, the arrangement made the kind of practical sense that was also, without anyone saying so, convenient for reasons I hadn't yet chosen to examine. She carried the Navy journal everywhere. She called it her thinking out loud book. She had never offered to let me read it. I had never asked. That was the implicit agreement, unspoken, the way most of our agreements were, which was apparently a pattern we'd been running longer than either of us had accounted for. I should be clear. I did not hide my journal. This is not a defense. It is simply a description of how things become possible. The previous Saturday had been the kind of February afternoon that makes productivity feel like a personal affront. Rain coming in gray and steady, the radiator cycling on. The kind of flat light that nudges you toward things that are easier to feel than to finish. I'd been writing at the kitchen counter, not copy, just the private writing I've kept since I was 22. When a therapist suggested I get what's in my head somewhere, it could be examined at a safer distance. I was interrupted by a phone call, then by the entirely separate problem of what to make for dinner, then by Mara coming out of her room in the oversized blue sweater she wore when she'd decided that the outside world was not going to receive her today. The evening redirected itself. We watched a documentary about competitive cheese making, which is both more and less interesting than it sounds. I forgot about the journal. She found it Monday morning while I was at the library working through a deadline. She told me later she'd been reaching for the pen she keeps next to the kettle, the black one with the chewed cap that has occupied the same spot since October and is apparently a fixed feature of the universe. The journal was on the counter. She said it fell open when she moved it, which I believe, because Mara is not someone who does things sideways when she could do them directly. And reading someone's journal without permission is sideways in a way she would consider beneath her. She had not intended to read it. What came next was her choice. She read 3 sentences, she told me. And then she put the journal down, and she stood still for a moment in the kitchen. And then she went to her room and got the Navy journal. And she came back and waited. I knew which 3 sentences. The entry was from 4 months earlier, the night she'd come home from a date that had gone the particular kind of wrong that's more embarrassing than dramatic, and sat on this same counter and told me she was beginning to suspect that love wasn't something that happened to her. It was something that happened to other people while she watched from a very sensible distance. I had listened. I had told her that wasn't true, and I had meant it, and later, after she'd gone to bed, I had written the thing I couldn't say while she was still in the room, that I had been watching her from my own very sensible distance for the better part of 2 years, and that the distance was becoming genuinely difficult to maintain. That was what she had found. I stood at the counter for a moment with the Navy journal in my hands before I opened it. The apartment smelled like the coffee she'd made that morning. She always made enough for 2 without asking, and the specific herbal soap she kept by the bathroom sink, a smell that had become, over 2 years of sharing this space, so thoroughly interwoven with my understanding of the word home that I no longer registered it consciously. Except right now, with her journal in my hands, I was registering it very precisely. She had moved from the counter to the couch. She was sitting with her knees pulled up, watching the middle distance with the focused non-attention I'd learned to identify about 8 months into living together. The expression of someone performing unconcern for an audience while being extremely concerned. Her fingers were wrapped loosely around her own knee. I told myself, page 47 might be a grocery list. Mara used that journal for everything. Meeting notes, film opinions, arguments she was having with herself about whether a second houseplant was a commitment she was prepared to honor. She had once spent 3 pages working through whether a particular restaurant's pricing model was ethically defensible. This was probably a misunderstanding. We were probably going to laugh about this in approximately 10 minutes. I have very poor survival instincts around Mara Chen. I opened the journal. The entry was dated 14 months ago. Not last week. Not last month. 14 months. Written in the tightest, most deliberate version of her handwriting. The one she used when she was putting something down that she intended to mean. I am going to do this once, and then close this page and not come back to it, because I am a reasonable person, and reasonable people do not develop feelings for their roommates. I read that sentence twice. I read what came after it. The evidence is as follows. He remembered I take my coffee with exactly 1 sugar. And I know this because he never asks anymore, and he always gets it right. He said my name once, in the way people say names when they are not identifying you, but placing you somewhere specific in their mind, and I have been returning to the exact register of it since March. He fixed the window latch without being asked because he'd noticed the sound bothered me, even though I'd never said so directly. And he didn't mention having done it. I found out by noticing the latch worked, and then understanding there was only one person who would have. She had left a gap after that, and then continued. He knows which silence means I'm working through something and need another hour of quiet. He knows I will not eat the last of anything. He left a note on the counter last Tuesday that said only there is soup, and then went to his room, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about how that is, objectively, an incredibly small gesture, and how I have not stopped thinking about it since. I stopped reading. This was very far from a grocery list. Mara was still on the couch, watching the middle distance. Her fingers tightened once around her knee. I kept reading. He makes this apartment feel inhabited in a way I didn't know apartments could feel. I have lived with 3 other people since I moved out of my parents' house, and none of them made the space feel like this. I don't know what to do with that information. Probably nothing. Probably nothing is the correct and defensible and sustainable response to this entire situation. She had underlined probably. Twice, then, in different ink. Darker. The pen pressed harder, clearly written on a separate occasion, weeks or months after the original entry. I have not done nothing. I have learned his coffee order and stayed home some evenings because he was going to be here, and I wanted to be where he was, and I have fallen asleep some nights thinking about the specific way he says my name. All of that is, clearly, the opposite of nothing. I am not certain when I made these choices. I think some choices happen in the space between decisions. In all the moments you don't move away from something. In all the moments you simply stay. There was nothing else on the page. I closed the journal. Held it for a moment, the navy cover slightly warm. Something in my chest had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. The way a door that has been almost closed for a long time finally comes to rest in its frame. I was aware of the rain against the window, soft and continuous, and of Mara on the couch, and of the 2 journals on the counter between us, and of the particular quality of silence that had settled in the apartment. Not awkward silence, but the silence of 2 people sitting with something that was simply true. I set the journal down. I didn't speak, and neither did she. I was thinking about all of it, not in an orderly way, but the way memories arrive when something unlocks them, in no particular sequence, with complete clarity. The night she'd come home with a novel she thought I'd like. No explanation, just set it on the counter with a note that said the 3rd chapter will do something to you. The text she'd sent from her room at 11:43 to say she'd saved me soup because she'd noticed I hadn't eaten dinner. The way she'd laughed the night we met, a genuine, unguarded laugh at a joke I hadn't even been sure would land, and I had filed it away immediately, in the category of things that matter, without understanding why. I had been keeping count for 2 years. I thought about the window latch. I thought about her standing in the kitchen trying to figure out who had fixed it. I thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October when I'd spent 20 minutes looking up which kind of latch kit would work on that specific frame, for a problem I'd noticed through 2 years of proximity and had never been asked to solve. And how I hadn't mentioned doing it because it hadn't seemed like something that needed to be mentioned. She looked away too quickly when my eyes found hers across the room. She had been doing that for a while. I had been permitting myself not to notice. She stood slowly, crossed the kitchen with the deliberateness of someone measuring their own movements, and stopped on the far side of the counter. The 2 journals between us, hers and mine. I had already decided to put them both away, she said. Close yours, close mine, make tea, and be completely normal about everything for the rest of our lives. She paused. And then I thought about what that would actually look like. The next 14 months of it. Her voice dropped, and I got a little tired. Her voice was quiet, not small. Mara's voice was never small, but stripped of the layer of precision she usually kept around herself like architecture. The biggest thing she'd said was said quietly. It always was. with her. That landed. I said, "You don't have to do this. We can close both journals right now, order from the Thai place, watch something without merit, and never mention any of this again. That option is genuinely on the table." She held my gaze, 1 second longer than felt safe. She did not move toward the television. "I changed your contact name," she said, "a year and a half ago. And I never changed it back because I liked seeing it every time your name came up. I liked what it said about what you already were to me." She looked at her hands on the counter. "And I think I'm done pretending that's a small thing. What did you change it to?" A small, precise smile, aimed mostly at herself, fond and slightly helpless. Something honest. I felt something in me snap into place. "Every person I've been with over the last 2 years," I said slowly, "I'd get to a certain point and think, this is fine. This is good." But there was something specific missing and I couldn't name it. I paused. I figured out what it was about 18 months ago, and then spent another 6 months deciding I hadn't. Something in her face changed. Very slightly. Just enough. "The window latch," I said. She went still. "You never said it bothered you, but whenever the wind came in you'd pause, just for a second, and then keep going." I noticed. So I fixed it. "And I didn't mention it because it wasn't a big thing. It was," she said. Her voice had dropped to the register she reserved for things she meant entirely. "It was a very big thing. I stood in the kitchen for 5 full minutes after I realized what you'd done. Because fixing a window latch is not a large gesture, but it is the kind of attention that means something. And I knew what it meant. And I wasn't ready to know what it meant." I reached across the counter slowly and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. She went very still. Then she closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she opened them, I had a name for the expression she'd been wearing since I walked through the door. Relief. The specific kind that comes from putting something heavy down and discovering the ground was there all along. "So what happens now?" she said quietly. "Same as always," I said, "but named differently." She laughed, the third kind, the rarest one, fully unguarded, and then her phone lit up on the counter. Her sister, calling to ask if Mara had seen a sectional sofa she'd found on an online marketplace because the listing was expiring, and she needed a second opinion immediately. Mara pressed her forehead against my shoulder and said, with tremendous composure, "I genuinely cannot believe her timing." I said, "Take the call." She said, "Absolutely not." Neither of us moved for a while. 3 months later, both journals were still somewhere in the apartment. Mine was back on my desk. Hers was on the window shelf she'd cleared out one afternoon, next to the second houseplant she'd finally decided to get. A small one. Low maintenance, she'd said, because she was a reasonable person. She did not mention that she'd named it. I noticed anyway. We didn't talk much about the journals. We didn't need to. A year after that, someone at a dinner party asked how we'd ended up together. Mara said, without particularly dramatizing it, "He fixed my window latch without telling me. And then I found something I wasn't supposed to find and handed him something he wasn't expecting. And it turned out we'd both been keeping the same count for a very long time, and neither of us had thought to compare notes." The person said that sounded complicated. Mara said, "Not really. We were just a little late." She said it simply, like an answer she had already made peace with, a long time ago, before she was ready to say it out loud. Years later, we'd both tell slightly different versions of the story. Mine started with the journal. Hers started with the latch. And the place where the two versions overlapped was where the real one lived. All those small moments, collected without meaning to. All that attention paid without being asked. All those evenings where one of us stayed because the other was going to be there, and neither of us said so, and both of us knew. Nothing about it had appeared overnight. It had simply, eventually, stopped hiding. What would you have done if you found your roommate's journal, open to something they never meant you to see? And have you ever realized, in one quiet moment, that you'd been in love with someone for far longer than you were willing to admit? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one found you at the right time, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.